So this morning's supply chain panel, we're missing our wheat grower director, Daryl Francoux. He's sick this morning, so I'm making the executive decision to have our wheat grower members, all of you in the audience today, as our farmer on the panel. So at any time, if you want to contribute to the supply chain conversation, please join us at the microphone. I'm not like Caitlin, you don't have to wait till the very end. At any time you want to talk and share, please do so throughout the panel. We'll give this to you guys. Let's get rid of this. Don't introduce Dean. Okay, got it. So thanks very much for joining us for the panel. We do have Cam Baker from Nutrien and Dean Klippenstine from MNP. All three of us are homegrown Saskatchewanians, all farm kids, and we're involved individually on the supply chain through various aspects. And I thought what we should start with is talking about what the supply chain actually is. For me, I hear the terms supply chain and value chain interchanged on a regular basis. But as a farmer, I look at them very differently. When I visualize the map of Canada and all of the ports of entry into our country, I think of the supply chain as the products that are coming into our port and filtered their way through the transportation system to get to my farm. I think about the value chain as what is taken from my farm and filters its way through the transportation channels and to export nations. So I think of supply chain as the way in and value chain as the way out. But I'd like to hear from Cam and Dean about where you are in the supply chain and whether or not that definition works for you.
Well, I would say it definitely does for us at Nutrien because we do both as well. I mean, we get our products to all of you out there as you're going along your supply chain to your ultimate value chain. But of course, we are a major exporter of products. And I'll probably talk at length about the potash side of things because that's really front and center for us right now as a company. Primarily driven by, and you saw Josh's presentation yesterday, but primarily driven by what's happened in Ukraine because we're in the process of trying to make up for about 40% of the world's potash market. Now, some of that is still, as he said, getting out through Russia, but Nutrien as a company, as a Canadian producer, is really one of the only ones that can scale up. And so the reason that that's important from a value chain perspective for us is that we're trying to get about, 30 or 40% more product out on rails over the next few years. So there's our supply chain that we get the frankly, bits and pieces that we have to put together the products and services that we put out the door to the grower customer. But then, of course, there's our value chain on the export side. And, I have all the stats, but I think Josh kind of did a really good job of putting them together yesterday, whether it be on the nitrogen, phos, or potash side as to what we're getting out of the country. So definitely, as a definition, works for us at Nutrien, but it's just a little bit different than yours, just similar sort of concepts.
Dean, do you agree with the definition, and who are the players on the supply chain?
Well, really we're just, as exporters for our product and commodities, really we're just part of someone else's supply chain. So I view it as an integrated supply chain to the end consumer, wherever that consumer is. And there's a number of different issues, and I was going to let Cam talk before I go into my rant as far as what I feel are the important key components affecting it, because they're enormous and they impact our life. And right now we have a buffer because we have record high commodity prices. So the bottlenecks in our supply chain are going to really rear its ugly head if we're selling $7 durum instead of $14 durum. It's going to really rear its ugly head. And so I think it's an important topic. Okay,
following that, Dean, is, for either one of you, do we have another mic? Can we maybe grab that mic, Fiona, and then Cam can have his own. Is agriculture a priority on the value chain and the supply chain? That's all we hear about now is how agriculture is going to lift the economy out post-COVID. So are we a priority? And if not, what is going to help elevate us on that priority list?
Well, Well, yeah, absolutely. I think agriculture is a priority because if you look at the products, and let's address it at the outset. I mean, you'd asked about the components of the supply chain, and I mean, rail, of course, is the largest being for all exporters and frankly importers. So, ag is definitely a priority, not just in our regular conversations, but I think more so than ever from the political standpoint. I've personally had inquiries from countries and embassies around the world that I've never interacted before, and oddly enough, when I'm talking like Belgium and Holland and places like that just never really reached out directly, and it all has to do with ag products, and that has really gotten the attention of both the federal and provincial governments, because I think ag, generally speaking, and this is kind of motherhood and apple pie, but we all know it, ag has been taken for granted for quite some time. What happened in Ukraine and with COVID put it at the forefront politically, and I think so it has become a priority.
Yeah, but I don't believe they've focused any energy. I think it's just lip service. In absolutely no uncertain terms, our export-orientated agriculture of Western Canada has not been given any priority and focus.
Yeah, but I tend to agree. And when the Wheat Growers Association thinks about our role in value chain and supply chain disruption, we think about what is the role of government, because we wish to lobby for better regulations and better rules. So if we think about what is the role of government and who is responsible for fixing this, I would say one of the few roles that the Wheat Growers can agree government has is in infrastructure, and to facilitate good trade and transportation in infrastructure. But if we are reliant on the government to fix it, what can we hope for in the short term to ease some of the anxiety that everybody on the supply chain has about the inefficiencies we see right now?
Well, and I think, again, we've seen, whether it's just even, let's just talk strictly financial, that there has been injections from governments, both provincial and federal, but I think it's been, as we've used the terms multiple times here, it's been reactive. So as you know, to complete any sort of, we'll just use ports as an example, the time frame from start to finish on getting a project first through the initial approval phases all the way clean through to the end takes quite some time. So even if you're putting in a whole bunch of money today, you're probably not going to see those upgrades until several years down the road. I won't even give a time frame. There's a port expansion right now that's been looking at approvals, I think, since 2013 out there. And is still, in fact, they're taking out ads in downtown Ottawa trying to move this ball forward. So it's a very long process, but at least from my perspective, from the conversations I've had, that there is now a sense of urgency around getting some of those dollars out there. Now, there's also far more caveats on those dollars than there used to be. I mean, there's GHG reduction requirements, there's water reduction requirements, all sorts of considerations that weren't there before that in all likelihood are probably going to extend some of those timeframes. But the good news is the dollars are there. The same thing with some of these economic corridor programs that they put together. The money is there. The question is, how quickly can you get it out the door and get shovels in the ground?
Yeah, Cam has the unfortunate position of giving a shit what people think about what he says. Yeah. And so I, in absolutely no uncertain terms, do not. If you took the Rafferty and Alameda dams today and tried to get them built in southern Saskatchewan, it would be a 60-year approval process. And port restrictions and things like that are the role of someone just to say, I don't care, we need to get this done. And those are good for all parts of the economy. For those of you who don't know me very well, I have no desire to give any subsidies to anyone in this room. I don't believe it's the taxpayer's job. But the government's role in basic core infrastructure is remarkably important. And we're bottlenecked by that. I looked it up on Google. Jared Gust's farm is 1,700 kilometers away from Vancouver. And so we've already got the burden of the natural barrier of trying to move a lot of large, heavy physical product to ocean to get it a far cheaper rate. And to add extra unnecessary logistics pain in the middle of that is absurd. I'm going to leave my most controversial plan to the end, Sherilyn. I don't want to steal the mic, and I do want to let Cam's discussion, because on the input supply chain, he's got remarkably deep knowledge on that front.
I don't know if I'd call it remarkably deep knowledge, but we do have to struggle with it as a company from time to time. Again, I think about in terms of where things were maybe 5 years ago from an export perspective as to where we're going to go, at least from a potash perspective, in the next 5 years. And so again, numbers don't mean a lot, but we went from 13 million tons prior to the pandemic of potash going out of Saskatchewan to a forecast of 15 million tons. And so, again, doesn't mean a lot. What it does mean is that that's about 10 years worth of production that's going into 2. So we've always modeled about 2 years increase in potash production annually, give or take. It's not flat. Some years it's 5%, some years it's 1%. And so we're doing that between 2020 and 2022. And then we're ultimately ramping up to 18 million tons. So what that translates into is a significant amount of changes to the way that we do logistics as a company, and frankly, the entire industry does across the board, because this goes back to the rail side of things. So today, we're moving more volumes through Canpotex out of St. John, New Brunswick, incidentally. So we're mining in Saskatchewan and sending it through St. John, because that's the way we have to get it out of the country. And it's only going to get more complicated from there, so.
How far is Jared from that port?
It's about 8 plane rides.
Eight plane rides, yeah.
Davidson Air doesn't fly direct to the coast?
Yeah.
He
Gust?
grows there, it's
When farmers, and I want to hear from some of you guys in the room, I know you have questions, but supply chain disruptions for us on the farm means more risk. And farmers are already taking on so much risk, but we do what we can to mitigate the risk to make us feel a little less uneasy. We tend to want to take control of the situation ourselves where we can. And so in the last decade, we've seen farmers take on bulk fuel tanks to try to mitigate risk with price fluctuations. They are building fertilizer sheds and chemical warehouses. We now have parts and equipment inventory warehouses on our farms. We are actually taking on every single piece of the risk. And last
And
spring,
the capital. And the capital required to fill those.
with also being price takers on the grain side of it. We're not even able to control the price on the other side of it. David and I were talking last night about the example last spring where there was a shortage of packer wheels for Borgo air drills. And the priority for those packer wheels was only to the new drills. So the older models were not getting wheels or parts, only the new models were getting parts. And this is just like one tiny example of where we are just continuously put at risk. But how much more can farmers take on in this risk? We can't, if we could build a railway, we might have done it already. If we could buy a port ourselves, we might have done that already. At what point are the farmers done trying to mitigate risk? We can't do it anymore.
Well, you touched on a couple things there, and I want to, before I forget, I want to make sure we talk about oil. Right now, diesel is significantly impacting your financial livelihood, and there's unreasonably high margins in refining of oil right now, and the reason of that is because the environmental impact is such an enormous hurdle that no new refineries are getting built. Like the expansion, because trust me, if any of you owned an oil well, the profiteering occurring between the oil well and the gas pump is not all going to the price-taking oil producer. If Gunther owned a pump jack on his land, he would not be able to connect the dots between the profit he would be making every barrel of oil he pumped versus what he's paying at the pumps to get refined diesel into his tank. And so I think we can't put numbers on those unnecessary hurdles that are being created and blocking these mega projects. but it's drastic, and it's impeding the market from working the way it was intended to work, and it absolutely is insanity, in my opinion.
And if I can just address maybe the capital outlay front, and forgive me here, because the conversation I had was with our head of Canadian retail, who's promptly taken his job in Australia, so this may be stale dated information, but we are adding multiple new sheds, and this is all in reaction to what happened in the last 12 months. And typically companies like ours don't plan on 12-month horizons, it's more like 10-year horizons. But significant amount of capital is going to be deployed to put in new, say, fertilizer sheds and some additional rail capacity at our nitrogen sites in Alberta, so that we can move product more quickly and adjust to some expansions there. So that money is being put out there. Totally take your point on the on-farm expenditures, though, because just ag has changed so much in the last little bit. And then as we transition, and this could be an entire panel unto itself, but as we transition around the world, through the changing trade patterns, like how much is going to be coming out of China after all of this, and you know, take the Russian and Russian ally conversation and put that in perspective as well, as to, are you going to be able to get the parts that were sourced before, or do we have to wait for manufacturing capacity to be built up in North America? And so we are in that slight transition period, I think, on whether it be implements, and again, there's people in the crowd that have a much better knowledge of that than I do, but, or inputs for, say, things like crop protection, things like that. Is it going to be coming from China? I know it's an open-ended question. I think we can all figure that some of those things are going to be changing probably in the next 5 to 10 years as the world continues to change.
Go ahead.
No, I wanted to talk about I was going to talk about the rail, but you go ahead.
Go ahead, yep. We can move to rail.
Fundamentally, we need to let the competitive forces of the market react the way they should.
Duopoly, we have that competition?
And in actual, and I'm not picking on our ancestors, but realistically, the most capitalist person I know would never, ever, ever sell highway number 1 to a trucking company.
Yeah.
Right? And effectively, we have sold highway number 1 to a trucking company. And I'm not blaming that trucking company. Their responsibility is to their shareholders. But the government should not allow, both US and Canadian, I believe the rail line itself should be a core infrastructure owned by the Crown, and independently owned and operated rail companies in charge of logistics and customer service. I don't know what your market cap is, but it's more than $50. You guys would be absolutely comfortable in running your own rail fleet in order to get your product to the ports.
Well, and I mean, probably not, but in some respects, we actually kind of have through, and again, going back to the potash side, through our partnership at Canpotex, as the years have gone on and the challenges have been put forward to the potash industry, Canpotex has responded. So say, for instance, and now they're widely used across various industries, but the potash industry came up with taking a longer rail car, smushing it shorter so that you can put more on, and you can create a 205 or 203 car unit train, and that represents about, give or take, about 21,000 tons of potash. So moving double the amount of potash through, because before it was, well, you couldn't get the car allocation because it was too short of a train. And then, and speeding up the throughput at the mine, and having our own maintenance facilities, and increasing the throughput at the port, all of those investments were made specifically by the industry in order to address the challenges that were put up, frankly, by the railroads, saying that we can't get you cars in time. So it has happened in the past. It doesn't mean that everything is awesome. It just, that capital had to been deployed by the potash industry.
Yeah, but we're trying to plug a dike with Band-Aids. Fundamentally, there's no accountability to allow commerce to occur the way it was intended. No one here is held captive on their local trucking to the elevator. No one feels trapped in the competitive forces are being allowed to work to get grain from your farm to the local elevator. Because capitalism works. Trucks charge too much money, and people put another couple trucks on the road. People charge not enough money, a couple trucks go out of business, and they rejig and make sure that the market finds And the market forces, and we can't legislate efficiency, to steal a line from a buddy of mine, Terry Uswa. You cannot regulate market efficiency. You need to let the forces occur naturally, and disconnecting the rail ownership from the rail operations is paramount, or we're just going to battle this thing for the next 100 years.
Okay, does anybody want to challenge Dean on that? Should the Crown own the infrastructure for the railway? Nobody in the room wants to challenge that? Okay.
Blair Rudder.
Blair Rudder.
I'll just turn my mic on. Okay, there, my mic's on now.
Stay there, Blair.
Well, Dean, I can't, as much as I don't like the duopoly, or however you want to say it, I don't see how a government can be in competition in business with another entity, and the other entity expect to be on a level playing field. So there have to be other ways to bring competitiveness into the system. And the fight against the railways and transportation, I don't expect it to ever end. It is part of the duty of all of us to continue lobbying for competitive elements to be brought to the system so that it functions effectively.
Appreciate that, Terry. Do we want to go to Blair?
Yep.
Okay.
I'm not convinced that government ownership of the rail line would be.
Turn your mic on, Blair, I think.
And all questions need to go to that microphone, please, because they don't, if there's not one there, so they need to speak up.
If you yell loud enough.
Is this okay?
Yeah. Thanks, Blair.
No, I'm not convinced that government ownership of the rail line would be beneficial. I mean, you look at the washouts, or anytime there's a rail disruption of the main lines, I'm amazed at how quickly the railways can rebuild a bridge, or there can be washouts and they can get back on service very, very quickly. And if it was government owned, you can bet that that would take twice, 3 times the length of time. And so you cannot convince me that government ownership of a rail line is going to provide you with better service than the 2 railways. I think actually the wheat growers did a lot of things on the transportation file to improve rail service. And I know there's lots of years when you're sort of, you're frustrated because you can't deliver your grain, but they've made tremendous investments over the last several years, and double tracking. But even, I think when I think back to 92, 93, when we had the real fiasco, there were some changes made after that.
Interswitching recently.
Interswitching, but the change that allowed each railway to reap the benefit of their own investment. They did not invest in rolling stock, or because they could never recapture any of that through the formula, the maximum revenue entitlement formula. So we worked hard to get that changed. Jerry Ritz, to his credit, really brought the railways to heel, because they realized that no, they're not in charge, that the government can instruct them in emergency situations to perform. So there's been a lot of regulatory changes, I think, that have benefit our industry. I think there's going to be tremendous demand. Like you talk about this potash increase, that takes a lot of rail capacity. And there's other ways that we can be looking at getting rail capacity. I mean, the pipeline issue. I mean, obviously, if there was less oil and gas on rail, the linkages south are another solution. And I think BN has done some. There is some linkages, but I mean, if that's your outlet for rather than going down the path of getting more competitive options south, is far better than seeking government ownership. And I'd be very alarmed, I guess I would say, if I saw the wheat growers advocating for government ownership of any piece of infrastructure.
So
my 2 cents.
No, that's good. I appreciate that, Blair, and you've been on the file, but we're trying to fix this with blunt instruments, and we really need to let the competitive forces work. So would you be in favor of selling number 1 highway to a trucking company?
No, not at all, not at all. But competition is the key, and it doesn't have, I mean, yes, the railways is a duopoly, I get that, but I mean, I'll always maintain that we want to lessen our dependence on rail, and, and that's through other, more value-added processing, more shipments to the U.S., just more avenues to get your product to market that don't necessarily involve the rail, or at least not in raw form. So, but I'm not a bash railway kind of guy in sense of, they have made investments, tremendous investments in ever since we got some of those regulatory changes made. So I'm not as pessimistic as you maybe, as far as their capacity to increase capacity. But I recognize, there are other commodities that also demand, rail capacity. So it's a challenge that won't go away, but I'm just saying I'd be very careful about going down the path of government ownership.
Go ahead, Daniel.
I've just got a comment to make. When Kinder Morgan was going to own the Trans Mountain, it was.
Oh, speak up, Daniel.
Yeah, when Kinder Morgan was going to own the Trans Mountain, it was going to cost $7.4 billion. Now we're at $27 billion, and the government owns it. So sometimes choices are only bad or worse.
That's an entirely fair comment. The other spin I've always debated about in this issue is whether it just requires separate ownership, that the infrastructure had to be an entirely separate public company and was not allowed to run rolling stock to allow the competitive forces. Because your point's well taken on government management of assets is not really ideal, but it also pinpoints the environmental pain caused on some of these infrastructure projects, which is absolutely not necessary.
Donald Orchard, Manitoba and BC. This is an observation and a question. Right now as we speak, Trans-Canada Highway in British Columbia is closed, so that all the traffic from Banff to Golden is rerouted through Radium Hot Springs, trucks, cars, everything, because they are improving Trans-Canada. And having traveled in Europe, Switzerland, Italy, without moving export commodities to Tidewater, their rail and road transportations go straight through mountains. We don't have a tunneling machine in Canada that can get through the mountains. And it seems to me, how did they do that in Switzerland and Italy? Who made the investment? Because that is, to me, the most obvious solution to increasing capacity to Tidewater is drilling through a few mountains. And when you consider the cost of Trans-Canada being closed intermittently for the last 2.5 years, to do a 3-mile highway improvement, when you could have, without disrupting traffic, bored straight past that through the mountain, made probably the same amount of investment, but not disrupted current flow of traffic, and ended up with a vastly improved system. Who put that money? If it was government, I would be in favor of government investing in that kind of infrastructure development, a tunnel borer, and then turn it into a public utility so people bid for railroads, bid for capacity, you put a toll on each end of it for trucks or cars or whatever. But I don't know who made the investment in Europe, but it's fantastic over there. You can cross Italy in a passenger car just to get from Rome to Ortona. There's no export. It's just simply to move people, let alone commodities. that earn wealth for the country. And they've done it, they have it, it's just a given. And we're completely devoid of that. The vision that built the railroad, that founded this country, is gone. And somewhere, somehow, we've got to reinvent new thinking on how we get from A to B. B being a port, A being the commodity that should get there and make money for everybody in Canada. I think that's a publicly justifiable investment of taxpayer dollars. But who owns it, how you operate it after that, that's beyond my thinking power.
Good thoughts, and unless you guys wanted to comment on that? Good?
I think that was a great summary, because you're right, the vision that built the rail line is gone, and the governments are involved in spaces they don't need to be involved in, instead of working on core infrastructure that is for the good of all of its citizens, not just us.
Most of the discussion today has been focused on the logistics of the transportation and the flow for our supply chain. One of the other regulatory pieces we face in supply chain are incoming tariffs. And I wondered, Cam, if you wanted to address some of the tariff issues that we face on the trade side.
Yeah, and by and large, and this is going to sound like a bit of a cop-out, but by and large we've been fairly agnostic to it, because it's really been an Eastern Canadian sort of issue, and I'm talking specific on nitrogen right now, because as a company we haven't historically done a lot of nitrogen sales out east. That's just the way the market's been. In fact, they're almost entirely reliant upon, or were reliant upon, Russian product. And so from a tariff perspective, I mean, it's not really a case where it's impacted us as a company. So I mean, frankly, I don't really have a lot of a comment on it, but maybe Dean, maybe you might.
No, the tariffs on the Ukraine-Russian dispute are not easy to navigate, and that's where I don't envy the governments trying to find the balance on that issue. That's very difficult. I know long-term tariffs are not really a friend of the open market, but we're in unique times.
Just last question. The wheat growers, many of their directors will be headed to Ottawa at the end of November, first part of December. And any chance we get to speak with our elected officials, we like to put forward good solutions. So do you have a solution that the wheat growers would be good to put forward in terms of better mitigating risks on our supply chain?
I do have one. Right now, there's a consultation open on changes to the labor code as it pertains to strikes, and particularly what government regulated industries can do during strikes. Now, it's not going to be the be-all, end-all, but the government has recognized that having the rail system held hostage, whether it be for days or weeks here recently, a couple times in the last few years, is an untenable situation. So they have actually opened up a consultation on that. I think it's open until the 13th. So if you're talking to somebody in transport, or of course anybody within even within the opposition, to advocate on any sort of thoughts you may have on that. The paper is actually pretty good. It's on, I think it's on the Transport Canada website, and it gives you the idea of where they're prepared to take a look at some changes. So that might be one. The other one that I've actually found a really good audience recently is within the senators, and the senators, I think, have become far more vocal in some respects in some corners of the Senate. So take some time, and just from a pure education standpoint, I mean, our senators from Saskatchewan and Alberta and Manitoba generally are pretty aware of the industry, but there are a lot of new senators that have been appointed, particularly from urban areas, that are actually quite eager to learn. And in the last, at least I'd say 3 years, the Senate has become a lot more prominent, maybe not necessarily powerful, but prominent in their ability to articulate and to push forward some ideas. So those would just be two quick suggestions on my part.
Thanks for those, Cam. Good suggestion on the senator's piece, and also the labor code. When I think about risk mitigation of the supply chain, I tend to have two categories. One is things that we can't control, things like the weather. That's always a supply chain disruption. And I often had labor issues and labor strikes and blockades in the list of things we can't control. But you make a good point that there are opportunities for us to engage and have influence over and maybe move that into the things we can control as part of our, or at least things we can influence. So I appreciate that suggestion.
Yeah, I echo Cam's thoughts on that. I think that's a very important topic. The two main issues are, I believe, is the separation of ownership between the operating entities and the core infrastructure.
Are you going to auctioneer that?
Am I going to auctioneer? Yeah.
The ownership?
Yeah, I'd like to take a 5% commission on that sale. But the other one, I know that's a stretch target, but until then, we're just going to be banging our heads against the wall trying to legislate efficiency, which is impossible. And the other one is the approval process for major infrastructure projects, regardless of where they sit, whether it's new nitrogen plants, whether it's port expansions. There needs to be some accountability and forcefulness of people who don't care about getting reelected to say, we just have to do this. Because right now, the approval process is extending beyond governments. Like it'll start in the Harper era and still not be done, finalized by the Trudeau era. And they both had pretty good runs. So we need to get that in place and move, because people are more afraid of they're more afraid of saying yes than they are of delaying projects, and it's holding the entire nation hostage.
You know, I like to use parenting analogies, Dean, and the most effective way for my kids to get approval is to bombard me with the approval text messages over and over and over and over again, and eventually I give up. So Dean's suggestion is that we over and over and over and over again bombard them with our suggestions, and that's been a fairly successful week or tactic in the past. Thanks for that. We have run out of time. I appreciate all of the engagement from our farmers in the crowd, and I really appreciate the time that Dean and Cam have spent with us here on the panel. So a big round of applause for Dean and Cam.